Hello everyone, welcome to Longarming by Jaclyn. This is just a quick video. Sometimes when customers are newer to quilting, newer to using a long armor, or there are those attic quilters where you go up and you find a top that was in the attic made by someone's family member, grandmother, whatever have you, and they want to get it finished but they don't know the words to use. There's like all this jargon in quilting. It can be very confusing, especially because quilters are apparently addicted to the letter B because everything starts with B, which doesn't make it any more clear in the ears, like all the words start to sound the same. So we're going to use this little pot holder to be our pretend quilt. So picture this as just a really small mini quilt. It's a hamster quilt. So the part that you probably have or probably have made is this, which is the top of the quilt, and it's thin, typically like a sheet, and it's got all of the patchwork on there. Sometimes it's a whole cloth, which means it's just one sheet of fabric without a bunch of seams on there. Sometimes that is a panel, which just means it's a whole cloth with a all over design printed on there or stamped on there instead of pieced in. So this all these little seams making a design, you can call this piecing or patchwork. And typically what we think of for the top of a traditional quilt is this patchwork pieced tops. And you will sometimes call that called a flimsy because it's real floppy and flimsy. So on the other side, you typically have a single piece of fabric. Sometimes there's one or two seams on there depending on how big your fabric is and how big your quilt is, but typically minimal going on the back. It might be one big piece of a print fabric. This one is a solid. Sometimes it's just a little texture back there, but usually less going on. Every once in a while they'll do an after quilt, which means usually bits and bobs that didn't get used in the front that got cut up or it can be done on the back, but that's kind of a specialty thing. A lot of times you don't have really anything going on, just pretty much one sheet of fabric. So this is your quilt top, sometimes called flimsy. This is your backing, goes on the back, and then all around the edge, enclosing the edge of your quilt, is called the binding. And there's a few different ways to do that. It can be wider. You can do a facing where it'll have no visible edge, like an infinity pool, but typically you will have, this is kind of a standard normal binding. So you've got your top, your backing, your binding, and one more B, you have the batting. So this is, notice this has a little more body, and it's got some insulation. We actually use this as a pot holder. It's got some fluff that makes the quilting design sort of poof up and be more visible, and that is the batting. So your insulation or your middle that you don't see, the fluff and thickness of the quilt, is batting. You've got backing, binding, and the top quilt. All right. And then if you're designing your quilt, let's say you want to purchase a custom quilt top and your quilter is asking you questions and you don't know what they mean, here are a few commonly used quilt design terms that you also may not really know what it means. So if you have your quilt top, you might be asked if you'd like to add borders, which is a frame around the outside. So this particular hamster quilt doesn't have any borders. My patchwork design goes all the way to the edge and I just stop and put a binding on it there. But if I added a frame around the whole outside of the quilt, that would be a border. And some quilts have no borders. You can have 1, 2, 3, however many borders you want to have. A lot of times in traditional quilting, you'll have a thinner one and then a thicker one is more of a traditional style. A lot of modern quilts don't have any border at all. It's kind of a more contemporary design trend for quilts. And then, not to be confused with sashing. So if you have a quilt that's blocks, a lot of times they're organized in a grid, and then in between each block of that grid, each individual block has a little mini border around it. So sort of like an overall grid framing each separate block, and that is sashing. So border refers to around the whole outside of the quilt. Sashing is like little borders within the quilt. And then where those sashings cross, a little contrast color square in there is called a cornerstone. So those are some other terms that you might hear as you're talking back and forth with your quilt designer and quilt maker, coming up with your custom quilt that you might hear. All right, so that was our quick little vocabulary lesson for attic quilters, new quilters, or people who are buying a quilt and don't necessarily know all the jargon yet. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a little something. So thank you for watching Longarming by Jaclyn. You can find us on Facebook. We're at Facebook/LongarmingByJaclyn. On Instagram, we're massey.jc. And you can get a hold of us there and start your order today. We do custom quilts and custom quilt finishing up to 12 feet wide. We do locally and by mail anywhere. So you can contact us to start your order today. And we've recently opened our pattern shop. So if you're interested in doing more than just finishing the quilts you find in your attic and you want to start making your own tops, you can find our link to our brand new quilt shop below in the description. And that's it. Have a great day. Happy quilting. Bye.